So it's Palm Sunday. Yay! And I've told that story before. You've heard this story perhaps. It's the story of Jesus and the apostles coming into Jerusalem for the Feast of Passover, as thousands and thousands of people did each year to make their sacrifices at the temple and celebrate this holiday of liberation. And as you can imagine, this often got the occupied Jewish citizens a little riled up. They would get a little excited and think, maybe we should have some independence around here. What would the whole celebrating the escape from Egyptian slavery? And so the Romans would call in a little extra firepower, have some more legions stationed around the place, and kind of keep a lid on things. And that's the context that Jesus rode into Jerusalem. Came in the workers' gate as the legions were coming into the city gate at the front, sort of a reversal of how things were. They were having a great march into the city with panoply and banners and, trumpets and drums, and Jesus was coming into town surrounded by workers who went to the date farms and by those who lived on the outskirts, and they were calling out Hosanna and throwing palm leaves down in front of him. Hosanna means save us. That's what that word means. So I've told that story, but a story that we don't touch on often in the Unitarian Universalist Church is the story of Holy Week, the Passion of the Christ, as they call it. And that word passion, it means suffering in this context. It's kind of like the word compassion, which means to suffer with. Come with passion, suffering. And so the Passion of the Christ is the story of his death at the hands of the state. We don't talk about it a whole lot, but I'm going to tell that story today. And you're going to be blown away. I'm going to tell it in the words of the Bible, and I'm going to try to make it sound like a story. This is the verses of Matthew. This is Matthew's Passion story. This is from chapter 26 all the way through chapter 27, so it takes a minute. But as you listen, I want you to try to hear this story in a different way. There are so many layers of meaning for many of us atop the story of Christ's death and resurrection. But here today, I want you to hear a human story of a man who spoke truth to power, of those who loved him and followed him and were afraid of the power of the state. I'm going to tell you about religious authorities who worked with the state to bring this man to crucifixion. And I'm going to tell you about the way the Romans handled the whole thing in the words of Matthew, or the person we call Matthew. This was written about 150 years after Jesus' death. And so it's not the most contemporary, but it is the closest other than Mark that we have. All right, so one of the 12, who was called Judas Iscariot, went to the chief priests at the temple and said, "What will you give me if I betray him to you?" They paid him 30 pieces of silver, and from that moment he began to look for an opportunity to betray his rabbi. On the first day of unleavened bread, Passover, the disciples came to Jesus and said, "Where do you want us to make preparations for you to eat the Passover feast?" And he said, "Well, go into the city to the certain man," here's his name, "and say to him, 'The teacher says, my time is near. I will keep the Passover at your house with my disciples.'" And so the disciples did as Jesus had instructed them, and they prepared the Passover meal. And when it was evening, he took his place at the feast with the 12. And while they were eating, he spoke and said, "Truly I tell you, one of you will betray me." And they were really distressed, and they began to say to him, one after another, "Not me, surely not I, Lord." And he answered, "The one who has dipped his hand into the bowl with me for this feast will betray me. The Son of Man goes as it's written of him, but woe to that one by whom the Son of Man is betrayed. It would be better for that one not to have been born." Judas, the betrayer, said to him, "Surely not I, Rabbi." And Jesus replied, "You have said so." While they were eating, Jesus took the bread, and after he blessed it, he broke it and gave it to the disciples and said, "Take and eat. This is my body." Then he took a cup, and after giving thanks, he gave it to them, saying, "Drink from it, all of you. Pass it around. This is my blood of the covenant, the promise that I make to you, which is poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins. I tell you that I will never drink again of this fruit of the vine until that day when I drink it new in my Father's kingdom." Then when they had sung the closing hymn, they went out onto the Mount of Olives. Jesus said to them, "You will all become deserters because of me this night, for it is written, 'I will strike the shepherd, and the sheep of the flock will be scattered.' But after I am raised up, I will go ahead of you to Galilee." Peter said to him, "Though all become deserters of you, I will never desert you." And Jesus said, "Truly, I tell you, before this very night ends, before the rooster crows at dawn, you will have denied me 3 times. Peter said to him, "Even though I must die with you, I will not deny you." And so he said all the disciples. Then Jesus went to them to a place called Gethsemane, and he said to his disciples, "Sit here while I go over there and pray." He took with him Peter and the 2 sons of Zebedee and began to pray, being grieved and agitated. Then he said to them, "I am deeply grieved, even to death. Remain here, please, stay awake with me." And going a little further, he threw himself down on the ground and prayed more. "My Father, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me. Yet not what I want, but what you, God, want." He rose and came to the disciples, and he found them sleeping. And he said to Peter, "So you just couldn't even stay awake for 1 hour? Stay awake and pray that you may not come into the time of trial, because the spirit indeed is willing, but the flesh is weak." He was afraid. And again he went away and prayed, "My Father, if this cannot pass until I drink it, your will be done." Again he came and he found them sleeping because their eyes were heavy. It was the middle of the night. And so leaving them again, he went away and prayed for a 3rd time, saying the same words. And he came to the disciples after and said to them, "Are you still sleeping and taking your rest? Get up and see, for the hour is at hand, and the Son of Man is betrayed into the hands of sinners. Get up, let us be going. See, look, my betrayer is at hand." And while he was still speaking, Judas, one of the 12, arrived. With him came a large crowd of people with swords and clubs from the chief priests and the elders of the people. Sounds more like a mob than an indictment. Now the betrayer had given them a sign, and Judas had said, "The one I kiss is the man. Arrest him." At once he came to Jesus in the garden and said, "Greetings, Rabbi," and kissed him. Jesus said to him, "Friend, do what you are here to do." Then they came and laid hands on Jesus and arrested him. Suddenly one of those with Jesus put his hand on his sword, drew it, and struck the slave of the high priest, cutting off his ear. And Jesus said to him, "No, stop. Put your sword back into its place. All who take up the sword will perish by the sword. Do you think I couldn't even now appeal to my Father, and he would at once send me more than 12 legions of angels? But then how would the scriptures be fulfilled? which say it has to happen this way. Maybe he knew the value of a martyr to a cause. At that hour, Jesus said to the crowds, "Have you come out with swords and clubs to arrest me as if I was a bandit? Day after day, I sat in the temple preaching and teaching, and you didn't come to arrest me. Oh no. But all this, here you are. It has taken place so that the scriptures of the prophets who came before will be fulfilled." And then all the disciples, afraid, fled him. Those who had arrested Jesus took him to Caiaphas, the high priest, in whose house the scribes and the elders had all gathered. Peter was following from a distance as far as the courtyard, the yard of the high priest, and going inside, he sat with the guards just to wait and see what was going to happen. He needed to know. Now the chief priests and the whole council were looking for people to come and give false testimony against Jesus so they could put him to death. But no one would come. And so lots of false witnesses came forward, but they weren't credible. Nobody could believe them. They had nothing. And finally, 2 people came forward and said, "This fellow Jesus said, I could destroy the temple of God and build it in 3 days." The high priest stood up and said to Jesus, "Have you no answer? What is it that they testify against you?" And Jesus didn't reply. Then the high priest said to him, "I put you under oath before the living God. Tell us if you are the Messiah, the Son of God." And Jesus said to him, as he had said to Judas, "You have said so. But I tell you, from now on, you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming on the clouds of heaven." And then the high priest said, "Well, that seems like a threat. He has blasphemed." He tore his clothes and shouted, "Why do we still need witnesses? You have heard his blasphemy. What is your verdict?" And they answered, "He deserves death." The high priests and counselors spat in his face and struck him. Some slapped him, saying, "Prophesy to us, you Messiah. Who is it that struck you?" Now Peter was still sitting out in the courtyard, and a servant girl came and saw him and said, "You also were with Jesus the Galilean." But Peter denied it before all of them, saying, "I don't know what you're talking about." And then when he went from there, because he didn't want to talk to her, out onto the porch, another servant girl saw him, and she said to the bystanders, "That man, he was with Jesus of Nazareth." Again, he denied it with an oath. "I do not know him." After a little while, the bystanders came up and said to Peter, "Certainly you are also one of them, for your accent betrays you." And then Peter began to curse, and he swore an oath, "I do not know the man." And at that moment, the cock crowed. And Peter remembered what Jesus had said, "Before the rooster crows, you will deny me 3 times." And Peter went out and wept bitterly. When morning came, all the chief priests and the elders of the people conferred together against Jesus in order to bring about his death. They bound him, they led him away, and handed him over to Pilate, the governor, the Roman governor. When Judas, his betrayer, saw that Jesus was condemned, he repented and brought back the 30 pieces of silver to the chief priests and the elders. He said, "I have sinned by betraying innocent blood." And they said, "What is that to us? See to it yourself." Throwing down the pieces of silver in the temple, he departed, and he went and hanged himself. But the chief priests took the pieces of silver and said, "We can't put them in the treasury. They are blood money." And after conferring together, they bought the potter's field as a place to bury foreigners. And for that reason, that field has been called the Field of Blood to this day. So at this time, Jesus, he's here, he's before the governor, Pilate. And the governor says to him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" And Jesus says once more, "You say so." But when accused by the chief priests and the elders, he did not answer. So then Pilate says, "Do you not hear how many accusations they're making against you? Are you deaf?" And Jesus gave him no answer, not even a single charge, not to a single charge, and the governor was greatly amazed. Now, at the festival, the governor had this tradition of freeing a prisoner for the crowd, anyone whom they wanted. So after they had gathered all the crowds and Pilate was addressing them, he said, "Who do you want me to release for you? Jesus Barabbas, the thief, or Jesus who is called the Messiah?" For he knew that the chief priests had handed Jesus over because they were jealous of his power. And while he was sitting there on the judgment seat, his wife sent a message and said, "Have nothing to do with this innocent man. I have suffered a great deal because of a dream about him. Don't hurt him." Now the chief priests and the elders, though, went out and they inspired the crowd and they persuaded them to ask for Barabbas and to ask Jesus to be killed. The governor again said to them, "Which of the two do you want me to release for you?" And they cried out, "Barabbas." Pilate said to them, "So what should I do with Jesus who is called the Messiah?" And they shouted out, "Let him be crucified." And he asked, "Why? What evil has he done?" But all they did was shout out, "Let him be crucified." When Pilate saw that he could do nothing, but rather a riot was about to begin, he took some water and washed his hands before the crowd, saying, "I am innocent of this man's blood. See to it yourselves." And then the people as a whole answered, "His blood be on us and on our children." I will take a brief notice here to say that verse has been used to justify 1,000 years of anti-Semitism, and it is not okay. And it is probably an addition from a later time. So, Pilate released Barabbas for them, and after flogging Jesus, handed him over to be crucified. Then the soldiers of the governor took Jesus into his headquarters, and they gathered the whole cohort around him. They stripped him and put a scarlet robe on him, and after twisting thorns into a crown, they put it on his head. They put a reed in his right hand like a scepter and knelt before him, mocking him, saying, "Hail, King of the Jews!" They spat on him. They took the reed from him and struck him with it. And after mocking him, they stripped him of the robe and put his own clothes on him and led him away to crucify him. When they came to this place that was called Golgotha, which means the place of a skull, they offered him wine to drink mixed with gall. That means the wine was terrible tasting and bitter and almost poisonous. But when he tasted it, he would not drink it. When they had crucified him, they divided his clothes among themselves by casting lots. They gambled for them. Who wants the sandals? Who needs this belt? And then they sat down there and they kept watch over him. And over his head they put the charge against him, which read, "This is Jesus, the King of the Jews." 2 bandits were crucified with him, one on his right and one on his left. Those who passed by derided him, shaking their heads and saying, "Oh, you who would destroy the temple and build it in 3 days. If you're the Son of God, why don't you just come down off that cross?" And in the same way, the chief priests, along with the scribes and the elders, mocked him, saying, "He saved others but cannot save himself. Let him come down from the cross now, and we will believe in him. He trusts in God, so let God deliver him if he wants to, for he said he was God's son." And the bandits who were crucified with him even taunted him in the same way. From noon on, darkness came over the whole land until 3 p.m. At about 3 o'clock, Jesus cried with a loud voice, "Eli, Eli, lema sabachthani." That is, my God, why have you forsaken me?" When some of the bystanders heard it, they said, "This man is calling for Elijah." At once, one of them ran and got a sponge, filled it with some sour wine, and put it on a stick to give to him to drink, to give him comfort. But the others said, "No, wait. Let's see whether Elijah comes to save him." And then Jesus cried again with a loud voice and breathed his last. At that moment, far away, the curtain of the temple was torn in two, the curtain that hides the holy relics, from top to bottom. The earth shook and the rocks were split. The tombs were also opened, and many bodies of the saints who had fallen asleep were raised. And after his resurrection, Matthew writes, they came out of the tombs and entered the city and appeared to many. But now at this moment, when the centurion, the Romans, and those with him who were keeping watch over Jesus saw the earthquake and what had taken place, they were terrified, and they said, "Truly, this man was the Son of God." Many women were also there. They were looking on from a distance. They had followed the whole way from Galilee and provided for him. Among them were Mary Magdalene, and Mary, the mother of James and Joseph and Jesus, and the mother of the sons of Zebedee. When it was evening, there came a rich man from Arimathea named Joseph, who was also a disciple of Jesus. He went to Pilate and asked for the body of Jesus. Pilate ordered it given up to him, and so Joseph took the body, wrapped it in clean linen, and laid it in his own tomb, recently built, which he had hewn in the rock. He then rolled a great stone to the door of the tomb. They were afraid someone would steal Jesus' corpse, and went away. Mary Magdalene and the other Mary were there, sitting opposite the tomb. The next day, that is, after the day of preparation, the chief priests and the Pharisees gathered before Pilate and said, "Sir, we remember what the impostor said while he was still alive. He said, 'After 3 days I will rise again.' Therefore, let us command that the tomb be made secure until that 3rd day, because otherwise his disciples may go steal him away and tell the people he's risen from the dead. And the last deception would be worse than the first." Pilate said to them, "You have a guard of soldiers. Go, make it as secure as you can." And so they went with the guard and made the tomb secure by sealing the stone. And my friends, that is the end of the story. That was Friday, the opening of the Sabbath. And for 3 days, we know that Jesus was dead. We know that his people were afraid. We know that the apostles went to the homes of other rebels and hid from the authorities. We know they were trying to decide what to do next. What is the next right thing? They were asking themselves, what does our teacher want us to teach? And that is the end of the story. For millions of people in this world, maybe billions, they don't ever get to Easter Sunday and the irrational, incredible joy and hope of new life, of renewal, of resurrection. They live each day in the liminal place of Holy Saturday, when Jesus is dead and has not come to save anyone. We wonder, what does this story speak to us as modern Unitarian Universalists? Many of us don't believe in the bodily resurrection, if not most. And yet, I think the story speaks so well for itself about what we are called to do. We are called to make the first last and the last first. We are called to honor the martyrdom of a man who spoke truth to power and was killed for it publicly with shame and excoriation. We owe that to him because we see these atrocities happening around us daily. I've never seen a person crucified, but Lord, I've seen some terrible things. And I am an innocent. I can't imagine what has haunted many around the world. I want to share a last reading. This is from the Reverend Myke Johnson. She quotes Isaiah, who wrote, "The Spirit of the Holy is upon me and has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. That one has sent me to proclaim freedom for the prisoners, to set the oppressed free, to proclaim the time of blessing from the holy." And Myke Johnson writes, "I wake in the night with pain in my heart that with all that is happening with our country, and I feel powerless. I've been an activist most of my life, and I believed and I hoped that activism might help change the world for the better, and it has in some ways, but the dream of the beloved community, the dream of a society rooted in cooperation and mutuality, in care for all people, it feels lost now, lost today in a nightmare of empire reemerging, like a multi-headed dragon from the flames of disaster. How do we respond to a reign of terror? How do we respond to cruelty after cruelty promulgated by the people in power? In my feelings of powerlessness," she writes, "an old friend comes to me, and Jesus comforts me by reminding me that in many ways I am powerless. I cannot control what my government is doing. Democracy itself occasionally feels like an illusion and a thin veneer over oligarchy and over fascism. And here is how Jesus comforts me. Jesus had no political power. He lived his whole life in the shadow of the Roman Empire, and that empire killed him. And yet, he was able to respond, to act. Jesus prayed and taught, healed the sick, listened, moved among the ordinary people, learned from them, and took correction from them, as when the woman confronted him at the well. He didn't concern himself all that often with the emperor or with the high priest or the governor. He was clear that those powers were evil, that they were oppressive, but he was not interested in them, and he went directly to the poor, to the oppressed, to the sick, to the prisoners. And later he offered this measure by which all people might be judged. I was hungry and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger and you invited me in. I was in prison and you came to see me. Whatsoever you do for the least of these, my relatives, you do for me. And there is a certain clarity in that, in the power of Jesus' powerlessness. And so we pray. Holy One, Spirit of life, God we know by many names, Universe. You who are with us in the midst of our powerlessness, help us let go of what we cannot control. Help us shift our focus to what is possible and what really matters. And bless those who are risking their lives right now to look after the sick, to bring food to the hungry, to bring comfort to the prisoner and the outcast. Help us to seek the spirit of life among those who are considered the least. Help us bring the first to be last and the last to be first. Help us to make level the path of love's work in the world. Amen.